Hello and welcome to week 5. This week we will be situating the ideas of having theories about the policy process into a broad context so that when we start diving into individual theories, we have a bit of a framework to better understand those. So sit tight, we're jumping in right now. So, I think the first thing we want to put into context is the idea of policy theory broadly. Some of this is an attempt to slow down what we're studying in order to better see the framework. One of the problems that I found when first studying policy theory is just understanding what has kind of been discussed and what hasn't been discussed, and where to place all of the puzzle pieces together. And one of the reasons why this is so difficult in the area of policy studies is number one, I don't think these things are taught in ways that make for good understanding, but also the field itself is so diverse, relatively new, and kind of always changing, so it makes it a little bit difficult. Policy research broadly is kind of a merger of studies about political science, sociology, public administration, institutions, and so on. And we're looking at the processes by which policy occurs and reoccurs sometimes. So when you look at politics, policy, and the administration, broadly, we're talking in public administration, broadly, we're talking about the policy process itself. Now, these theories, we have to think about theories kind of in um, a broad way, and I mean that in the sense that everything is a theory, despite how much proof we think we have on a day-to-day basis. Gravity is a theory, for example. But theories, in this sense, are a research tool by which we study policy. And really, what we're looking at these theories to do is to narrow the scope of inquiry. What is it exactly that we're looking at? What part of the process are we looking at? Maybe we're looking at a set of shared assumptions or a set of shared concepts or principles that are at stake. And these theories help to narrow down kind of what we're looking at in terms of the policy process itself and the larger scheme of public policy. Now, one thing that makes this very complicated is there's no big overarching theory that incorporates all of these things into it. We'll talk about the policy cycle as providing some amount of framework for us to visualize it. But there is kind of some deliberate mixing of frameworks and theories from political science and sociology, psychology, even to kind of better understand these intricate pieces. And part of the reason this becomes so kind of difficult to study and get your hands around is that it is so diverse and covers so much. So what our goal is this week is to talk about the ways in which these processes, these theories kind of fit together, and we'll revisit this again in a few weeks once we've gone through more of them to kind of resituate your learning from the rest of the semester from here on out back into this idea of theories. So these public policies involve actors, surroundings, or environments, as we've talked about them, interactions, etc. And all of these factor into these various processes that sometimes work together or might actually work against one another. So, for a minute, let's revisit this policy cycle. We started with this a couple of weeks ago, talking about the ways in which issues emerge, agendas are set, we select from alternatives, policies are enacted, we actually implement them, and then evaluate. That's a very normative kind of this is how things should be done version of the world. In reality, the process is A, not as clear as this cycle would make it out to be, and B, maybe isn't as cyclical, right? Agenda setting may move back and forth here with issue emergence quite a bit. There might be some trade-offs being made. Alternative selection, it's not like once you get there, you can't go back to issue emergence if new things arise that make this alternative selection more complicated. That said, the policy cycle might actually offer us one tool to understand both public policy and theories of public policy, because what will often be at issue here is one part of this cycle. Because what we will see these policies do is take, a chunk of this, maybe one or two of these things, and say, this is how we believe this happens, and here's the evidence we have for that. And I think that's really important to understand here, is that the cycle itself is not perfect. This is not a perfect example of what policy looks like, or how it happens. But it does allow us to dive a little bit deeper, so we can complicate it through research rather than just saying, hey, this isn't a perfect example. And for a moment, let's actually complicate what policy is. And when I say complicate, I mean, we've been using kind of a set definition or a shared definition about the choices that policy actors make, or what government or the state decides to do about public problems. And that's true. But I want you to understand that policy theorists themselves have differing definitions of what policy is. And those range from the broad, kind of whatever government chooses to do or not to do, so really encompasses everything, to the narrow, more like the ones you see at the bottom here, where it is kind of a course of action or inaction that is taken on purpose, that has distinct purposes, maybe talks about things like resources, behavior, collective action, etc. So we have differing versions of what policy is itself. And sometimes when we dive into these different theories, the definition of policy changes a little bit. So I want you to be aware of that, so that when we do talk about it in different terms, that doesn't kind of come as a surprise. Broadly speaking, and this is not a perfect set of buckets here, but we can divide up policy studies into kind of three broad categories, only one of which we will be tackling for the rest of the semester. One is policy evaluation. This is taking what a government said it is going to do, and then look at what happened and see whether it fulfilled its goal or not, right? So this is kind of just looking at using tools, evaluating what happened based on what was said was going to happen, and maybe previous outcomes in other areas. That's policy evaluation. Policy analysis is a normative study of what should be done. The objective here is to determine what governments or public actors should do in response to certain issues or facts. So policy evaluation happens after the fact, policy analysis happens before the fact, and then we have studies of the policy process, which are, if you think about it here, we're kind of zooming out a little bit with studies of the policy process. And what we are concerned with when we're talking about the policy process is how decisions get made and why decisions get made. Not so much do they fit the goals, which is a policy evaluation question, or even what should be done next time, but rather what happened this time and who made the decisions and why. So these might be broad studies about why governments pay attention to certain issues, or why policy remains stable over time, or how individuals and groups affect policy over time, or where policy comes from. So for the rest of the semester, we're going to be focusing on this bucket here. That isn't to say these two things aren't important. It's just this here is our main goal, so that you have a better grasp of the ways in which policy has thought to occur over time. So if we want to break that box down a little bit further, there's a few ways to do that. One is to use we can go back to the old policy cycle and do that. But since some of them feed into different areas here, I thought it might be important to kind of bucket those up, and so you can kind of see what we'll be studying. So for the next couple of weeks, we will be looking at issue emergence. When do issues become important enough to garner attention on the policy-making stage? And so there are a couple of theories of that we will look at over the next couple of weeks. One is called multiple streams theory, the other is called punctuated equilibrium theory. Both of them tend to provide an answer to the question of when do we start to pay attention? The next bucket is how is the agenda and the set, or how are the alternatives or options aligned? So we'll be looking at policy feedback theory, advocacy coalitions, social construction, and policy narrative framework to think about the ways in which the policy problem is dealt with just at the beginning stages. What is available in terms of options and why? Then we will look at theories about implementation and innovation and diffusion. When we see policies work in area A, do they necessarily move over to area B, or do people not learn in that kind of linear way? And then also implementing policies. What are the issues surrounding implementing policies that make for worthy study of the policy process in of itself? Implementation studies are kind of fascinating, and we think about, kind of the fun stuff back here about how do we construct the problem and all of that. But once we actually have chosen a solution, how is implementation done, and how can we zoom out and look at the ways in which that has happened over time? So all of this is to give you kind of a broad understanding of what we'll be looking at the next few weeks, and to set up your learning in kind of a useful way that makes sense for how we'll be studying these things. So I know this is a short lecture this week, so I really wanted this week to kind of slow things down a bit and serve two purposes while we slow down. The first is to do what we've been talking about over the past few slides and kind of think about where we are headed next and situate it in a better context. And as I said a little bit earlier, this is something that I really wish had been done a little bit better for me personally, because understanding policy studies is really difficult, and kind of separating what we are dealing with and what we're not dealing with is something that no one kind of slowed me down to understand, and I kind of had to learn myself over time. So I want to make sure that you don't have fall into the same kind of mistakes about kind of getting confused about, well, are we evaluating policies, or are we analyzing policies, or are we theorizing, and where that all falls. So hopefully this will help set you up for success in that regard. So that's objective one. Objective two is to also introduce this new unit about disaster readiness. So this is our next kind of substance area that we'll be picking up on. This is an area that is really ripe for a lot of different types of theories about the policy process. Certainly innovation, diffusion, and how we learn about just implementation. These things kind of, we could use disaster readiness kind of across all of these areas. But I want to introduce it here as we start to talk about the ways in which maybe events or certain actors or certain failures might influence kind of how decisions are made and the timing of those things. And so disaster readiness serves as a good example of that. The kind of impetus for a lot of these studies is often environmental. So things like Hurricane Katrina, or certainly any kind of hurricane, any kind of disaster readiness. There's a lot of research about Tornado Alley and learning in Tornado Alley and the different types of policy learning that's gone on there. But we have kind of these things happening more frequently now, in part due to climate change, that require us to think about how droughts and famine and hurricanes and stronger storms and different types of weather are going to influence our policy decisions, and how that's going to happen over time versus how it happens right now in the moment when we have a disaster at hand. I think that allows us a good framework for kind of talking through some of these issues. So that's why this is the first unit kind of on that docket. And it raises a lot of really important questions about the policy process and what we can learn from the policy process, and how we can theorize how policy gets made, and when issues emerge. That's the real key here, is when issues emerge. And, disaster readiness, or just disasters in general, they throw it in our face. And, there's always those famous quotes about, life makes other plans for you. And that this is kind of the the it's really at the heart of what we're talking about, right? Because we're going along making other policies, we're making other decisions about government, and then we have a disaster that we weren't prepared for, and all of a sudden we have to change course. So this will allow us to ask a lot of, I think, important questions in that regard, that become really instrumental in framing how we understand the policy process and how we understand just how issues emerge in general. So this is the question I want you to talk about this week, and welcome to the new circles. We've kind of shaken things up a little bit. I want you to broadly think about disasters. The government is often caught kind of flat-footed, without a plan, when it comes to these disasters. Do you think that the disasters not can they, but do they act as a catalyzing event that teach us to do better for the next disaster, to come up with new policies, new ideas, new methods and processes? In other words, do we use disasters to make new policies? And can you think of any examples over the past couple of decades? Disasters might include 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, etc. For this week, though, I want to caution you, stay away from the Flint water crisis. We will certainly get there. But I want there to be a little bit of distance from the events that we're talking about, when we're talking about policy making. Because the Flint water crisis is so recent, some of the things that we are going to be talking about in the next week or two probably don't fit into that framework quite as well. So focus on kind of these disasters over the past couple decades, and think about, what have we learned from them? And it doesn't have to be just 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina. There can be other ones as well. But do we learn to initiate new systems? And do you think that this is a catalyst, or a primary catalyst even, for policy change and policy making? All right. Have fun in the discussion circles, and I will talk to you soon.